If we can remove people for intolerance and offensive on the opposite end, they wouldn't blink twice. Wouldn't blink twice to have us sort of removed, fined, or put in prison for saying certain things, perhaps. But we would, because we believe in some tenet of free speech, and in that sense, it's a rather imbalanced approach.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Oxford Conservatives podcast. In this video, we're going to be talking about what is free speech, what end is free speech working towards, and also, do we have free speech? Archibald, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Joshua. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a fine Sunday today. I would like to ask you the first question. What is free speech?
Well, you see here, Joshua, it is I who shall be asking the questions. As the famous usually punchline goes to, where if a Nazi, a Gestapo officer goes and knocks on the door, they say, who's there? And they say, it is I who shall be asking the questions. And in some sense, I think that predicates this idea of a free speech discussion. Are we indeed free even to make such jokes of quite a bland nature and rather truthful nature? And are we even allowed to have our speech in itself? Or are others supposed to say, you can say that, you can't say that? And that is, I suppose, in itself free speech. Free speech is the ability to say, almost express a variety in all sorts of ideas in a medium that one wishes to express it in. In its ultimate form, there is no restriction on free speech. However offensive the item might be, however distasteful we find it, there isn't a prevention on it, and that is indeed to protect the rights of, good, unfettered, proper speech, and also that of the offensive nature. For to distinguish between the two is an inordinately hard task.
I believe that to be the case, and you do touch upon a few different aspects there. The limits of free speech that one might want to impose on, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And also, what is the goal of free speech in general? Because that's also a very interesting question. You talk about how one should be able to express themselves in whatever way they want. Should we allow people to express themselves in whatever way they want? Or should we have them be able to hold certain opinions, but to express them in a certain format in which is acceptable, perhaps?
There should be a restriction on the format, then?
Well, I'm not sure, actually, and perhaps we'll discover this via the art of Socratic dialogue.
Yes.
But there does seem to be a position where certain people might have very brilliant ideas, but the way in which they express it may not be up to standard, or may be rather vulgar, perhaps. And I think there are times where we do want to consider the potential limitations to free speech.
Yes.
And a good example of this would be racial content or racial remarks that people might make about other people in society, which people might just simply deem offensive, or things against other people's religion. For example, if I started insulting Muhammad here, should that be allowed? Should that be accepted? I think there are questions there. Even if my criticism of Islam is indeed correct, is that the proper way to go down our discussion? I think that's a valuable question to have.
Yes. I suppose, in the sense of absolute free speech, no, there should of course be no restriction. If we are to approach that in a very libertarian view, the government should have no control over that. Again, in social society, there should be no control over it. And I think that's where we come to at almost a loggerheads, to some extent, between types of free speech and the type of society in which we live in. We currently live in what would be described, and has been described by the Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, as a liberal democracy. And if we're in a liberal democracy, indeed we should have free speech to its ultimate end purpose, to its ultimate purpose of ultimate freedom of speech. And again, even in this liberal democracy, such freedom does not necessarily exist. We see this in recent cases, and which will later come on to that of Kathleen and others. But if we live in a theocracy, so let's say a Catholic state, then of course I can see there being good reason to have limits on free speech. The blasphemy laws indeed should be enforced. It's right and proper, and it's upholding a true moral order that comes from God and comes from objective moral truths, where I suppose I would object in some sense to being a Muslim theocratic state, or a Jewish theocracy, or even a Buddhist and Hindu and so on, because I simply believe it isn't true. It's not true, and it's heresy. So in that sense, I disagree there. So I think that's where we come into the two types of society: the liberal democracy in which we apparently live, and that of a theocracy. And perhaps it's best to discuss the reality rather than the hypothetical.
I think there's room for discussion for both topics, and I'm sure we'll get to the theocracy later. But let's start off with the liberal democracy. And you raise a very interesting point by saying free speech works towards the end of just having freedom, absolute freedom in some sense. I would perhaps make an initial objection to that free speech, even in a liberal democracy, cannot just be for the sake of free speech in general, because it, in one sense, seems rather circular. It seems weird to justify free speech on the grounds of free speech without any further intrinsic purpose. But if one were to say, for example, that free speech was there to develop and help the ultimate goal of reaching the truth, for example, then I think free speech is helpful in one sense, because you would say, okay, we must be able to interact with each other, disagree in a free sense, so we can move forward as a society. But at the same time, you could say, well, comments which perhaps are ridiculous or hurtful may not indeed help towards that truth-seeking purpose in the same way.
But do you not face then a particular problem? That if we say certain comments are hurtful or offensive or don't contribute to the aim of the pursuit of truth, who are we to decide what is hurtful and what does not aim to the pursuit of truth? We have to have some sort of authority there, and in that sense it's not a democracy. It's not ultimate freedom either. So I think it reaches two ends. If we are to follow out democracy, or rather freedom and liberalism to its full extent, we can then not have this sense of restrictions of which we face.
I think the idea of the need for authority does indeed raise a significant challenge, because there is the famous question of Pontius Pilate to Jesus, what is truth? And in some sense, under a liberal democracy, there is no ultimate adjudicator of what truth should be. And as a result, you might say the fundamental axiom of a liberal democracy is that it just pursues truth for the sake of pursuing, not truth, but rather freedom, for the sake of pursuing freedom, regardless of the potential consequences. Which then brings us back to the question, well, in a liberal democracy as we see today, or at least as Rishi Sunak likes to call the UK, well, are we actually seeing free speech? Do we actually have free speech? Because I was on my reels the other day and I came up across this very strange statistic that the UK has thrown loads of people in jail, or at least have tried or charged loads of people due to apparently hateful or problematic tweets on social media or something along those lines.
Well, it's a very interesting act, and what I suppose this podcast could in principle fall foul to, of the Malicious Communications Act of 2003. And this act I think it was originally intended to sort of have public order offences on the internet and sort of to limit those offences. So perhaps in public, if we start swearing at someone, in this country, if we abuse someone in public, we can be arrested and put in the clink under a public order offence. But it didn't really apply to the internet, per se. So I think that's what the ultimate aim of the Blairite Act in 2003 was. But it has been misused quite often. We see the famous example, I think it was of Count Dank something or other. He was on YouTube, he posted a video of his dog doing a Hitler salute, and he got charged and prosecuted under the Act. And I imagine he got a fine, or he got a suspended sentence or something of the like, but he got charged and prosecuted and got a criminal record because he was on YouTube and he made his dog do a Nazi salute. And here we're not supposed to be, lauding and saying it's marvellous he did a Nazi salute, what a wonderful thing it is. But in a free country, however offensive we find something, in principle we should allow it. In much the same way, I may find it very offensive if someone starts waving vigorously at me. Perhaps in some example, person waved very vigorously at me and I've always had something bad happen exactly after that. So I may find it hurtful. Does it mean I should get it removed? Certainly not. And this is not to put the Nazi salute and that of, I suppose, waving vigorously at someone on the same level. But it's to say that in our world society here, one is offensive and the other isn't. But one can quite often imagine a society in which the other is offensive and the former isn't. Perhaps we take in China, or in Imperial China, if certain things were not done certain ways, if there were not enough kowtows done, that was a great offence. So those levels, I think, must be realised.
I think that raises a very interesting point, because you talk about the original desires or intent of the Malicious Communications Act, and in some sense you'll say there's quite a lot of virtue for that. In the same way I can't run up to the street and start insulting someone's mother or whatnot and then not expecting my face to get punched out. In the same way, what's the difference between doing that online or doing that in person? And online, especially with that barrier of anonymity, it perhaps is taken to an even greater extent.
Yes.
Both of us having a social platforms, perhaps we can experience some of that.
Yes.
Now, I guess the question then arises as well, what makes a difference between the two? Should we even distinguish the idea between a physical and a verbal, or internet, in-person, or online communications? Is there a way to distinguish that?
I believe in free speech in an absolute sense, no. But that raises, I think, the interesting question of whether absolute free speech should indeed be allowed, and whether it raises a good end, or whether free speech with a limitation, which is necessarily not free speech, just sort of free speech, would be a better off option.
I think that's a very interesting question, and I would tend to move away from absolute free speech because I believe there are initial problems of having that absolute free speech purely because there is very good reason to suggest that people can be significantly hurt by certain information, and of course there's a degree in modern society where people are getting hurt way too easily. But if someone was indeed faced by constant racial abuse, constant religious abuse, constant forms of other abuse that could arise from unbounded free speech, it could have very drastic impact in the same way as a physical attack may cause. For example, someone might end themselves in a YouTube monetizing a way to say it, but there are implications of having unlimited free speech, and I think there are ways which we must find a fine line about how we could control it.
Well, I suppose it is unfortunate, but some these cases are unfortunate. Long-standing abuse verbally is unfortunate. So I believe perhaps, but we do face problems, even if we say, all right, let's have things where our limit is we make sure all speech is therefore respectful to the other person. These words, their legal definitions, have to have some sort of grey area. They can't be an absolute. So what must count as respectful towards you is not necessarily what counts as respectful towards me. So in that sense, some things are rightly ridiculed. Indeed, in society, things are rightly ridiculed, and other things are not rightly ridiculed. But to put that line and balance onto it as a sort of retrospective action and say, no, that's free, that's allowed and that's not allowed, we have to have some sort of judgment. And because the judgment is human, and the judgment is indeed susceptible to social influences, it is not an objective judgment. And that's where we face the problems in law if we start to enshrine limitations of free speech. We face occasions where perhaps a very left-wing, to use a pejorative sense, woke legislator or legislative decides to put in sort of all restrictions on pronouncing very normal Catholic everyday things, sort of homosexuality is a sin, abortion is morally abhorrent, and a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And to say such things may very soon be outlawed because to some, indeed, they're offensive. And I recognise, indeed, they're offensive to some. I do not intend for people to take offence to them, but people tend to take offence to them. And in the other sense, if people say, well, yes, Christ was just a made-up figure per David Strauss, or you see other things, sort of Christians are all bigots, the last person who is racist on the earth who's standing with the Bible in their hand, as an Oxford course description reads, I might rightly view those as offensive. But to have either outlawed, to say, well, you must not have those and I must not have these, could not exist in a functioning liberal democracy, for we very soon outlaw our opponent's speech because we somehow find it offensive. And that's the part I think would be interesting to come in. How do we justify this idea of something being offensive? How do we define it, even? And I wonder what you think on that.
I think you raised two interesting questions. Firstly, what are the prerequisites of a functioning liberal society, and are those prerequisites something that we're willing to pay? Perhaps having a functional liberal democratic society is a bad thing. Perhaps this is not the ideal form of government. In fact, I might like to suggest the idea of some form of Plato's philosophical kings in the Republic, where you have a set of philosophers who rule the movements and what is allowed within a society. Of course,
and when the philosophers forget that we need to eat and drink, and rather than spending all day thinking, we soon have a massive collapse of all social order and we all die.
Precisely. But nonetheless, I think there might be some value to that. Though, I do think we could perhaps turn to a discussion on what are the ends of free speech. Why is free speech important? Because we all have an intuitive recognition that some form of free speech is important, but to what degree it is important is...
I would argue there aren't forms of free speech. I'd say there is free speech, and there is what is not free speech. And what is not free speech encompasses a wide variety of things, but none of them indeed are free speech. To have free speech is unfettered speech. And once one contravenes that and starts to put on caveats, I think that's again the question I was wondering is, who decides those caveats, and how do we know they're right?
Well, I guess to perhaps rephrase that then, one could say, well, perhaps by understanding what is the end of free speech, one might realize the end of free speech is in contradiction to the very mode of free speech itself. And if there is that internal contradiction between the ends of free speech, what we're trying to achieve with free speech, and the actual functioning of a society with free speech, then perhaps we should throw free speech in the bin and perhaps metaphorically bring up a more restricted speech society, but within the qualifications of what we initially thought free speech was meant to do in the first place.
So what would you think the ends of free speech is? Or the ends are, indeed?
I think the end of free speech can only be working towards the truth. Because why do we want to have any discussion or talk in general? What's the use of the word? Is very much to decipher what, I guess, in the classical Christian sense, people identified as a logos. We want to use the word to be able to discuss things with people, to figure out the truth, and move towards that truth in a way that you can say something, I could disagree, and I have the freedom, or at least the ability, to disagree with you so that we can actually move towards a certain goal.
But, so if that is the only tenet of free speech, how would you view comedy sort of fitting in there? Because you could say, let's say, Ricky Gervais, who's a famous atheist, or he's an atheist to my lesser or greater understanding, and he would say many sort of jokes here and there, not for the aim of pursuing truth, but for the aim of causing laughter and mirth. Should that, again, would that fall under this idea and principles and sort of end of free speech?
Well, Plato would perhaps agree with that and say, let's get rid of Ricky Gervais in some sense. And, well, while I'm not too completely unfond of that idea, I think he does a lot of good things. But in a more serious sense, I would say perhaps truth is too limited of an idea. Perhaps the development of the virtues is a higher thing, of which truth is part of.
Once you've reached this truth, let's say, this logos, what is there then to do? Should we then have no more free speech because we've achieved the truth?
Well, I believe that might be a result of a difference in belief about what the essence of truth is. I like to view the essence of truth as something which is infinite. It's a movement towards something which has no boundary. There is no state in which truth is truly, fully revealed. There's always something more to know. And therefore, free speech is always important in understanding, both reflectively of oneself and also of the world outside us.
But I suppose, taking that, if we look at how modern society is formed and how we've progressed from the Enlightenment right up to, we see, the postmodernists of the 1960s, perhaps existentialist thinkers, and we see this idea now of our truth in this worldview is we each have our own truth, and there's, well, we disagree with this, we have our own truth, and a man can be a woman and all sorts of really hyperbolic things. If that is indeed the aim of the pursuit of truth, should we allow it to be said?
Well, I would say it should be allowed to be said, but that's the role of free speech should be used to correct them, to have that discussion. Because I would not say that I would not say wrong propositions are necessarily detracting towards one's form of the truth. In fact, to have wrong propositions without any free speech would be to prevent that wrong proposition to be corrected. Rather, allowing people to have a proper form of a presentation of their ideas is equally reflexively important with someone having incorrect propositions, perhaps.
So if the person said a man can be a woman, we should allow them to say it, but we can correct them.
Yes, precisely.
But is that not where we come into the problem and the conflict between this idea of a limited amount of speech, of that which is allowed to pursue the truth or to some extent to aid that purpose, where we view it as, yes, it's a differing opinion. But the problem is, surely, when I come to it, I say, but I believe, no, a man's a man and sex and gender is immutable. They might find that offensive. So that's where offence comes in, because we both believe we're pursuing a truth. We both have different ideas of what the truth is, and we want to correct each other. But one part of it is offensive, and they view it as entirely offence. It's like if I went into the street and said, oh, I think you're very fat, that might rightly be viewed as offensive. But indeed, if it's a pursuit of the truth, is there a limitation on that? So I think we still don't really get away from that problem of what offence is, in that sense.
I agree we might not get away from what offence is, but I do believe that we would at least be able to understand a criteria in which offence is not even meant to be thought of in the first place. And perhaps you could say, well, then I'm just accepting the idea.
Then what is offence? Is what I'd like to get
I think
at.
offence doesn't really occur in this society where free speech is there to further the truth. People don't get offended by the propositions themselves, but rather the way in which they're presented. If I go up and say homosexuality is a sin, which I do believe is the case, and we should stand strong too, I think there is nothing wrong with that in the perspective of the truth. But if I were to then say that homosexuals should all be executed and eliminated, exterminated, then, well, I would say that is going beyond the lines of saying that is a form of the truth, but rather it should be a form of, well, okay, that's gone beyond the proper ends of free speech.
But I'm sure I could find you many chaps or girls in Oxford who would find that offensive, the first comment.
But then that would not work towards the truth in any sense, because I'm saying let's accept the initial framework that the end of free speech is to develop the truth. Therefore, offence is not even a category about what should be allowed or not. Rather, what is the restricting category is, does this comment aim towards the development of the truth? Perhaps?
But could we not agree that offence is something a bit fluid? What may offend one person is different to what offends another.
I completely agree with that, yes.
So if we accept that point, there can be surely then no criteria of what offence is. Because if the ultimate defence in a court of law, for example, is always it was there to pursue the truth. Well, if I say to the person in the street, I believe you are fat, or I believe that you need to get a proper job or something like that, or exercise more, something like that. Which in many senses would be defensive, and of course, I'd never go up in the street and say that. It would be, indeed, not in a charitable way. But that could be argued in some case. I'm sure I could argue it in a court of law that was in the pursuit of the truth, the truth of objective reality. And therefore, could we outlaw a certain case?
No, I don't think we should outlaw those cases. And I think that's some
So therefore, can we outlaw any sort of offence? Indeed.
I don't think we should. And I'm not arguing that we should outlaw any
of course.
offensive ideas. In fact, I think the framework, the schema that I provided towards the truth, but I think in a broader sense we should say towards the virtues at large, offence isn't part of that. I would say that offence should not even be a criteria in which we even think of. So when someone says, oh, that's offensive, I'll be like, well, so be it. I don't care about whether you think it's offensive or not. That's the pursuit of the truth.
So therefore, the society should have an almost unfettered form of free speech, because really the general restriction to free speech is that of offence. Where if I say something, and I say something, perhaps if we take a Kathleen Stock case where she doesn't believe a man can be a woman, and it's viewed as so offensive that people are trying to get her fired, and there's people who have been fired from certain jobs, and because they view free speech as, I suppose, Hamza Youssef, the First Minister of Scotland, says free speech is not an unfettered right. It must be balanced with the right and need to protect vulnerable groups from discrimination. So he puts this caveat here on offence. That's really the only objection to free speech is, it causes offence. So in this sense, the pursuit of truth is perhaps just the aim of any form of speech. Anything that comes out of our mouths is in principle to the pursuit of truth. It is to, even if we try to, let's say, we purposely, and it would be terrible if we did try purposely to offend someone, perhaps we're aiming at a truth there, and it's only really offensive if there, perhaps there's some remnant of truth there, or indeed it's merely its nature of being offensive is something that it's true that it is offensive. So, to sort of cut down all that waffle, the objection to free speech is that it may be offensive. And if we agree offence should have no part in making it, and if speech is allowed or not allowed, then surely we must, therefore, in principle, have unfettered speech.
I would argue that there is a line which can be drawn in between the limits of offence and the limits of truth. I'm saying that offence itself should not be considered a category, but rather offence as an element of the pursuit of truth can be a category. And what I mean by that is saying one can have a very cordial disagreement about homosexuality or transgenderism and such stuff, but then if one also then added loads of subscripts within their art about how bad homosexuals are and whatnot, maybe bringing different bananas and tools to say, do you recognize these tools to someone in the middle of things, one can say, well, perhaps you are crossing the line in a lot of areas. And I think there is a valid kind of argument that can be made, and to what degree that is made, it could be up for discussion. Let's accept that. But nonetheless, there is kind of a line in one's pursuit of the truth in which offence can play a role in it, such that the person who's trying to present their opinion has gone way beyond the mere argument which is required for the pursuit of the truth, and then they add all the insults and offence afterwards.
So you're saying it would be with the manner of something?
Yes, I believe it's very much based on the manner.
Yes, yes. But let's say we're having a hearty discussion of why capitalism is better than communist. And let's say, for all intensive purposes, you're communist, and I'm big, mean, fat, capitalist pig. And I ridicule parts of communism, so I say, oh, it's silly, look at the lines in Moscow, how you see the Ronald Reagan famous joke, where a man goes in to buy a car, and they say, oh, it'll be ready for you next year on the 3rd of March. And he says, morning or afternoon? The car says, well, why does it matter? It's a year time. And he says, because I've got my dentist appointment booked in the morning. Because of the such long lines. So therefore I ridicule capitalism. And rightly could be deemed as offensive. I make some other jokes, and bits here and there of insulting communism. And it's all done right and proper because it's something that is terrible, must indeed. Ridicule is a large way to distill and get rid of such terrible ideas. In principle, the manner which it could be delivered could be rather haughty, could indeed be viewed by some as condescending, even if it is true. Would this not fall foul?
I think you raise a valid point here. And perhaps one could appeal, I guess, conceptually to the idea of an allegory. What you've raised is not only an idea of an insult, but truly an allegorical situation to demonstrate the underlying subconscious reactions to the implications of a communist system, perhaps. Whereas I think there's a difference between applying that allegorically than just labeling someone with insults, or even just the word choice, for example. If I approached an African and I used the N-word instead of just labeling it as a black person or whatever. I don't know what's the right way to call an African anymore these days, but nonetheless, if one were to say something like that, perhaps you could say, well, okay, that in that sense is not worthy towards the truth. Now, in other areas, there's perhaps a bigger grey area, and I'll like to lean on the side of caution to say, well, let's allow those things to happen. But I do think there's an area which is quite clearly, when it is crossed so far beyond the line, there is an area where it's okay, that's beyond the line.
But I think it's interesting. You admit there's a line, I suppose, that will take your point. But the slight problem I find with that is the humans are not perfect. The line is not necessarily perfect. There's plenty of lines that have been drawn, and we realise 10 years down the line, oh dear, that wasn't very good. Either it was too far away, or it was too close. And it's on that line of who decides offence, because you may think, oh, that's crossed the line, and I might sit here, and I suppose on other things we may disagree, that no, that's actually perfectly within the line. And to establish that, we must either have a democratic system where people vote, but then we risk the rule by the tyranny of the majority, which is a separate issue in itself. And that's why I propose the two parts I came to in my opening statement. This idea of a theocracy, something driven by eternal values, where they're quite clearly set in what we should and shouldn't do, and they're set in moral laws, and that's what we should follow. Perhaps indeed the Catholic Papal States is a marvellous example of how it could be run. And in that sense, we should accept it, and that's how we should run. But in the other sense, where we live in a liberal society or a democracy with a multi-plethora of views, or even, I suppose, a benevolent dictatorship to some extent, with a plethora of views inside one society, if people think different things, there we must have unfettered free speech. Because otherwise I think we face the problems where even we've got into debate where we think perhaps some things are offensive and certain things simply aren't. We have to have that unfettered free speech in order to even debate these sort of ideas.
I do think you are touching on something, and perhaps what our discussion so far has done to show is that in the way people have these ideas of excluding all the other options to get towards the truth, perhaps we've demonstrated the significant problems of both liberal democracies and an idea of trying to control free speech in that society. And I do think there's problems with both scenarios. And that leads us to the question of a theocracy.
Yes.
And perhaps we can discuss that partially, perhaps not in full depth.
Yes.
But I do think there's an interesting argument to be made here. Perhaps you can present an argument for why a theocratic society should exist, and also maybe not how it should exist, but also the ways in which free speech should work within it. Because perhaps there are some ways in which we also disagree on that point.
Well, so a theocracy would exist in the form that we take there as an eternal creator. There are eternal sets of rules and laws that we must follow, and they're set down from the divine. They're unfixing and they're unchanging. So quite different to our democracy, where Parliament decides its laws. Sometimes abortion is moral, it's fine, it's legal, and other times it isn't. Sometimes we see someone can change genders, other times we can't. So suddenly a taxation is right and just, and other times it isn't. Suddenly some wars are allowed and others aren't. I think you would get the picture. But we could have a theocracy, where things are set and they are eternal, where things don't change. And if there are indeed eternal moral laws, no form of natural temporal law should be able to change and edit them. It should not override them. So indeed it must just be the law set down from God and is simply there. There's no qualms about it. It simply just is that murder is wrong, adultery is abhorrent and is wrong, all of these different parts that are key tenets of a faith or religion. And there we have, indeed, the theocracy set out. We have a set of rules, and we have a perhaps earthly figurehead who is God's representative on earth, that of perhaps even a divine king, or who believes very much in the Catholic faith or Christian faith, or as we see in, Iran, the supreme leader of Iran, and the Muslim caliphates of the medieval ages. So that's, I think, our idea of a theocracy. And as I say, if we have indeed true, right, moral things laid down, why would there be any need to change them? We simply need to enforce them. Nothing else needs to be done.
But is there a role for progression in such a society? And that's the question.
There's no need. The point is, progression is always something working to something better, but if something is already set out as this is best, this is simply what is, it's the marvellous thing, as it is about the Bible, is there's a quote from a TV programme, I think, The Young Pope. I've only ever seen clips, and there's a marvellous clip, very, very truly with me, even though it's fictitious, of this Pope saying it. And he was saying, the Bible and in Catholicism is not like an iPhone. It can't be upgraded. And that's a good thing. Because if it can be upgraded, it will be discarded away. It doesn't last forever. It isn't eternal. Something that simply is just utterly good is not something that's discarded and moved on from. It simply just is.
But would you say there is almost an element where theology itself, and perhaps on the issues of morality, we have a strict sense of morality, at least in the big issues. So there are smaller questions of morals about new developments in technology, how are we meant to respond to them? There can be developments and applications of the natural law to those ideas. But in the idea of theology, perhaps, there's a strong line of saying, okay, what is heretical and what's not? For example, Gnosticism is heretical in the same ways as a lot of forms of early church kind of traditions. Those were deemed heretical, and rightly so. But,
I think there's still one line of early church traditions that wouldn't be classed as heretical.
Of course. Or that of the Catholic faith. But nonetheless, there is this element where I'm not so sure whether I would agree with you that all of theology, or that the whole church is itself finished. It's not an end product, but rather it's something which develops. And I am aware that's not exactly what you said, but that is at least the impression under which free speech can be restricted, at least.
Yes, I suppose that there are obviously developments to some extent, but I wouldn't do it as a progression. More there's, you've painted a picture and you're painting around it and you're growing the picture ever larger, but you don't change necessarily what is already there unless something out of painting needs something fixed. But that is, I suppose, pursuing the truth. Whether we can indeed have an eternal set is debatable, but generally the core tenets aren't as changeable as democracy. I think that's what I was attempting to get across. That they aren't as fluid. That things are more set, and in that sense, our speech in that sense might be saying, "Oh, is this right or is it wrong? Does it abide to the moral law and natural law set out? And if new things arise that haven't been thought of in natural law, how would they fit in with what we have already set?" I think that's where the free speech would play in. But there isn't as much need for a great form of debate if things are generally set. If things are indeed set. If they're not set, they must be debated and, at least in the Catholic faith, be voted on in ecumenical councils and so on, and you have the power of the Holy Ghost guiding in that sense.
Yes, and perhaps what we both agree on is some almost a desirable state of this theocratic society, and perhaps I'll imitate Plato by saying, until theocrats rule the world, that there will be no end to the evils in our society.
Yes.
Perhaps that is a fundamental conclusion of perhaps the conceptual discussion that we've had in this episode so far. But I do think there's a practical discussion that must be made in relationship to free speech. And a good example of this would be the control of the left on free speech in some sense, and especially from the perspective of deplatforming, because deplatforming has been a very big challenge in modern society. You have a lot of YouTubers, a lot of TikTokers, or people on society around the world who have certain ideas that they want to present, but then they present a certain idea or have a apparently controversial president of the United States on their channel, and then they get completely deplatformed from that channel. Yes. I was wondering, what do you think is the proper response to these situations? And should we even try to control the actions of private companies of who can be on their private platforms and not?
Well, you see, here we face an interesting issue. For I believe we do have an objective natural law. So certain things shouldn't be allowed. We see pornography is not a good thing to have on the internet. We see, I suppose, things which we don't allow, good and proper moral values. We shouldn't have promotion of murder and so on. But so far as we live in a liberal society, absolutely not. There should be no end restriction. It's only if we live with a certain set of moral codes that are shared by all, where we can then start to impose certain restrictions on little bits here and there that are simply immoral and will lead someone away from the salvation that Christ provides. And that's looking from a Christian standpoint. But so far as it's a liberal democracy, no. There shouldn't be a limit on who someone puts on, for it goes against, indeed, the very tenets of liberalism, or rather, liberal democracy perhaps isn't even the ultimate solution. Liberal democracies don't necessarily allow unfettered free speech, which I suppose is a key tenet of a liberal worldview, is the freedom, and freedom is not necessarily respected. So here, yes, I think it's awful. Private companies sort of, actually, I suppose it raises an interesting question. Do private companies choose? And it becomes very hard. It's like, so, let's say I have a dinner table in my home, and I decide I don't invite just 50 random people off the street because I don't like their views round to eat with me at dinner. Should that be illegal in the same sense that should private companies be allowed to regulate? So there, yes, private companies should certainly be allowed to regulate who they want on their platform. Just to a greater or lesser extent. But I think there must therefore be a platform that everyone can access that is not regulated in that sense, that's perhaps state-owned, that provides a bastion for free speech and allows free speech to be put on. Because naturally, private property, we have the rights of private property, we can do what we like in the private property to a greater or lesser extent. But it also means limiting things, if we would wish it to be limited.
I definitely agree with you on that point. I mean, as much as people like to complain about big companies deplatforming us and big media, whatever these things are, I do think there's almost a fundamental element where the people who are complaining would also be strongly against the idea of government interference in the private property. And as a result, there almost is this natural need for us. And people have done it. So, for example, people are being deplatformed off YouTube, for example. People then move to platforms like Rumble, which are perhaps more free, if that's the way we want to present it. And vice versa. So perhaps there's an element from the lens of, well, let's let the government control it, or just that other...
It's not good business.
Yes.
It's simply not a good business decision, though. And that's why I think perhaps we should have... indeed, it faces a very tricky problem. So we say, suddenly, yes, these should be allowed to deplatform, and then we face a swathe of deplatforming. We face the mainstream media sort of presenting one shared set of views and nothing else. And then we start to be coerced, and we don't then live in a liberal democracy. But once we have freedom of the press, we allow things, we stop monopolies, effectively. We allow things to have their own say. Then it creates an unfettered amount of society, which is free. But I'd like to get back to this, it's simply not a good business decision. If YouTube has controversial people, if I owned YouTube, I'd put them up. I may disagree with them. I may think it's abhorrent, but I would put it up. So far as, again, it does not put illegal content, I suppose, is the part where we can't put on free speech, because to some extent, would it be a fettered free speech and so on, it's a separate discussion. But it's very good business, because you get a whole set of audience who would no longer be on your channel if you deplatform them. You get a whole variety, and that's also why Twitter's doing wellish at the moment, because it can get people on because there is free speech. And free speech allows people to use it as they wish. And therefore it gets used more, has a larger audience, more revenue, so on and so on. So it's a marvellous decision, and it would be unwise in business not to allow it.
I think your business nuances is a very helpful thing for us. Perhaps we should not only start Oxford Conservatives Talks podcast, but a business venture as well. So if we do that, make sure you stay tuned for this channel.
Yes.
Let's bring us further, and you say, government should enforce free speech, perhaps.
Yes.
But at the same time, we've seen a lot of governments in the past restrict free speech in a lot of different perspectives, in Canada, around the United Kingdom, around the world in general.
Yes.
What should a government's position be on free speech, and how could they face this problem?
As I've said before, in a liberal democracy, there should be unfettered free speech. It sounds horrendous, and it sounds terrible. Perhaps it even downright sounds offensive. But that is the price we have to pay to have freedom, the freedom of thought, the freedom of expression, and indeed the freedom to be offended. Because I may not like what my opponent is saying, but I like what I say. My opponent may not like what I'm saying, but he likes what he says. We both like what we say, therefore we should be allowed to express it. And if I suddenly shut down my opponent in a logical sense would have every right to shut down me. And in that sense, we certainly should allow it to be unfettered without control from the government. And that's where we face problems in our society. There's plenty of places that claim they have free speech. You see the likes of Scotland, pretending it is a liberal democracy, but once it is now trying to put a hate crime act through that outlaws speech in the own home, where it must then be reported to police, and discrimination and this and that and offence is all outlawed. We face a very worrying problem. We face a problem where no longer are we free to speak our mind, but we must speak what has been ordained that we can speak, that we must speak the truths that society has set down, not dare to question or abet or say something mildly different. And that is where innovation comes in. That's where new thoughts, ideas, that's where interesting ideas come in. If we were to just sit here, you and we'd say the same thing over and over again because that's what Sunak has said we should say, that's what Mr. Starmer has described, this is just the truth. Not even necessarily coming from a theocracy, but this is just the truth. We'd have an inordinately boring conversation, wouldn't we? If we were no longer able to make jokes. I mean, I think comedy indeed should be unrestricted. I find most people, even on the left, find dark humour funny and they giggle to themselves and then they think, oh dear, I shouldn't have said that. That was offensive. Oh dear, I must flog myself 20 times. We start to create this crazy idea where we have no idea what's offensive or not. It's just what someone's decided on Twitter to say, that's offensive, 50 people join in, and suddenly it grows to 50,000. It's utterly nonsensical. We can't judge offence very easily. It's not something I believe we can even give. And once we put a restriction on, it ends in a very, very sorry state.
I don't think I could put it better than you have just now. Though, us being in Oxford, perhaps we should talk about some more recent matters, perhaps.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Kathleen Stock, for one, and
yes.
a personal experience for another.
Indeed.
Let's start off with Kathleen Stock.
Yes, and now I'll let you deal with the other one. That's very kind, I am.
Yes.
So Kathleen Stock is an interesting case. She was a professor, or was a professor, at Sussex University. I think she was Cambridge or Oxford educated, what the truth, so, a good solid education. I mean, I may not agree with her personal lifestyle choices, but I think she is generally on the straight and narrow in regards to the issue of the transvestites. And here, she simply claimed that she didn't believe a man could become a woman, and she believed it would infringe on female spaces. She was what we would call a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, and it's supposed to be some sort of insult these days to be a TERF. And when it's said like a TERF, it does sound rather like other unscrupulous and rather sorry and sad words. And Kathleen Stock was cancelled, there were protests outside, there were calls to have her fired, there were even death threats made against her and other threats of violence, and there were masked protesters on campus doing all sorts of vile abuse. And she decided, this was back in I think 2021 or 2022, she resigned from the, out of massive pressure, she resigned from the University of Sussex. And last year she came to the Oxford Union to speak on the issue, to have an address to the Oxford Union and be interviewed. And I watched the address. I thought it was a bit wet. Not that, Kathleen Stock is wet, but I thought it was not as far as I would go. It wouldn't be exactly, she wasn't as hard line as I suppose I might be. And she effectively made some allude to a man can't become a woman. It is dangerous to women's spaces and so on. But the amount of protests that there were, they were trying to get the union to deplatform her, the union had to hire security, and all sorts of other things, where there were literally mountains of protests. There were JCRs condemning Kathleen Stock. There were the Oxford LGBTQ Society saying it was vile, they felt very offended and, unsafe that this would happen. The union even put in a welfare room, because God forbid a student heard something they found offensive, that they disagreed with, and found upsetting, and they had to have a welfare room to sort of... I mean, if you're going to find something you think might find offensive, I may suggest to you, either grow thicker skin or don't go. It's not being forced onto you. It's not something where I'm saying you have to listen to me speak and I'm not going to allow you any welfare. Of course not. We're not saying that. But if you choose to go and watch something, if you choose to go to an event where you have a controversial speaker and you think they might offend you, I'm terribly sorry. I think there's something that's gone wrong if you then must get your welfare, because you just must... It's another person's opinion. And she wasn't being offensive and virolic when she was saying such. And there are protests going day and day. They were shouting outside the union. It was almost when Kathleen Stock came to the Cambridge Union, there's a very similar occurrence. There's a protester who stuck her hand on the floor and said, "Trans rights are human rights," and sort of saying she was denying the trans person's humanity, that they dying, even so far, quite a lot came. She was saying that a trans person's identity didn't exist. She was denying their existence, the trans person's right to existence. And I find that rather entertaining, because it's nothing to do with the person's existence as a human being, that they have human rights or do not have human rights. It's to do with, we don't accept that someone can change from a man into a woman. We're not saying they're no longer a woman, or they're no longer a man, or they're no longer human. We still accept that, and they should be treated indeed with dignity, as a man and as a woman. And indeed, there should be certain restrictions. But this was the massive uproar that was put on. And it was quite amazing. And the university rightly said, no, this must be allowed, there must be free speech. And the part that came further was the Oxford Student Union, which hosts the Fresh Affair each year, then tried and did attempt to remove the Oxford Union from allowing it to stall. And the Oxford Union makes a lot of its income off new students who sign up at the Freshers' Fair, to deny this Oxford Union an income. And that's where it went a step too far. And the university said to the student union, no, you're not allowed to do this under the law. It goes against free speech, as the Free Speech and Higher Education Act actually enshrines. It goes against free speech, and we will sort of either get rid of the Oxford Student Union. If you don't do this, we will sort of we'll remove our connection with you. And that's what happened, so they were forced out of the hole and they allowed the Oxford Union to happen. But imagine if we had a university that didn't decide to stand up to it, and did allow it. It would be free speech incarnate shut down. And that's the rough summary of it.
I think you've presented a huge load of information about the Kathleen Stock interview, and I think it's...
Perhaps too much,
but no, I think it's
interesting
vital.
to say.
And the idea about the JCR condemning, I think, was completely, absolutely, utterly outrageous. Because our JCR ourselves have not only condemned it outright, but also sent money to a trans society or
and then more than that,
about
they put on, again, it's a set of it's disputed by the college, but one has received legal advice to the opposite, or suggestion at least, that they produced a trans harassment policy that seems to go against the very notion of free speech in the Higher Education Act. So they went very far, and that was our JCR pushing that. It was JCR-led.
Indeed.
And indeed, I think there were, I can't name names, there were some people higher up who thought, we don't want this, but they nonetheless had to put it through from the JCR.
Yes, and I felt that was completely outrageous from the perspective of virtue signaling, because if every time someone took offence to anyone speaking around the world, that someone must put through an act like this, you will be seeing acts all the time. Because surely they're not only offended by Kathleen Stock coming to the Union, there's a lot of better things to be offended about. Think Ukraine, think other places around the world, even Israel-Palestine, no one said anything about it.
Well, there was a horrific talk, which happened in Regents the other day, promoting some sort of recreational sexual improvement drug, or rather pleasure drug or something like that, the history of it, and some other stuff of a lecture from the Oxford LGBTQ Society that I thought is entirely offensive to my religion. I think it's not just its content, it's not even just sort of talking about sexual sort of history and so on, but it was promoting something that was a drug and so on. And I think I'm pretty sure it's an illegal drug in this country. It's like promoting almost the history of cocaine and how it wasn't really damaging. It was a marvellous addition to hedonistic pleasure, which I suppose many might agree it was. But I'd still view it as wrong to promote in university. I then don't put a JCR motion through it condemning it. Well, most likely wouldn't get passed, but we should surely have the opposite would happen, and there would be uproar that such a motion would be tried to put through. But if there's uproar on the opposite, if there's uproar against the Kathleen Stock motion, well, then the hammer comes down on the head. It's shut down, absolutely. You're not allowed to sort of condemn our motion condemning because it's so obvious that we're right and we're virtuous.
Well, the hammer didn't only try to come right at Kathleen Stock's head.
Yes.
The hammer fell on, well, attempted to be falling on our head, but was rather unsuccessful, to say the least. And the backstory, as viewers of this channel, I think you deserve to know some of the context of what goes on between our experience. So recently someone, and I wouldn't name names because we don't know any names, but someone apparently found 2 videos on this channel rather offensive. Of course, there was the first episode of the Oxford Conservatives Talks Pride Month video, and also, curiously, the dangers of homophobia within the church.
And we don't know what they found offensive, so we can't comment on that.
Yes.
But we got again, reported.
And we got reported. We had to talk to some senior figures in the college hierarchy. And what was very interesting here was the fact not only that someone would watch it, but that someone would find offence to it, and then watch 2 videos of it, and still find offence to it, and then try to go complain about it. What I thought was very interesting was because if this podcast was called the Oxford Liberals Talks, I can guarantee you that no Conservative out of their right mind would even bother doing the same thing.
Would even bother listening.
Or bother listening, exactly. I mean, I don't think I would listen to Oxford Liberals Talks anytime soon, but I am glad you've listened that far.
We only need to step into our JCR to hear that, really.
Oh, yes, that is very true.
But I think I gave fairness to the college authorities. They had to respect free speech, and they did so, which is pleasing to see.
Very, very good.
But it's more the attempt to shut down free speech is what is worrying, what is chilling. Especially if we move into greater society where these people eventually become the judges and the lawyers, or perhaps even the politicians or financiers or even academics of the new era, where they want to shut stuff down. And we see the old guard who believe in some tenet of academic freedom removed.
I wonder what can be done to respond to, or what can us as Conservatives do? Because I think a very big danger which is existing in modern society today is a result of the fact that the Liberals are very outspoken. They see something they don't like, they complain about it, and they have this idea that whoever makes the loudest voice, the loudest complaint about anything in this world, that's the one who wins, perhaps. But if you think about the Conservatives, we don't really say anything about this because we just look at it, people who disagree with us, as completely, well, either respectable because they have good opinions that we can interact with, or it's just completely outright ridiculous and we don't need to respond to them at all. We don't try to deplatform people, not because we think what they're saying is correct, but just because we don't think that there's any value to deplatforming them. So should Conservatives actually try to fight fire with fire, or is trying to just fight fire with kindness just a completely losing battle to begin with?
Which I think is always best to ridicule. If someone puts ridiculous ideas, and they're absolutely laughable, to treat them seriously, to put the proper respect that is due if it's a proper academic dispute, is almost to give it credibility, to give it credence. And it shouldn't necessarily be done. If we see, for example, the idea that a man can suddenly be a woman, 70 years ago if we said that to someone, they say, oh, you were joking, what on earth do you think? But nowadays we must treat it seriously, apparently. We see other things in that cancel culture happens. And I would say we treat it unseriously, we treat it and no need to cancel. But the slight problem with that is the other side doesn't play by the same rules. And their laws go in to try and remove everything. And indeed, to make it seem fair, they put on the caveats to allow us to do the same. We would never do it. Or at least some similar caveats, not to the same power as exists on the opposite side. And I say we might as well use them if they're there. If we can remove people for intolerance and offensive on the opposite ends, if they want to remove me, the point is they wouldn't blink twice to deplatform us. Wouldn't blink twice to have us sort of removed, fined, or put in prison for saying certain things, perhaps. But we would, because we believe in some tenet of free speech, of free Socratic discussion, and so on. And in that sense, it's a rather imbalanced approach. It's like, I suppose, when one is fighting, I suppose, in some sense, a sense of war, and your opponent plays dirty, and you play cleanly, it puts one at a disadvantage because there are certain things which make it easier to win, but one doesn't do because it is against the general standard rules of law and being respectable. But if your opponent, a terrorist group, does the same, they're perfectly happy to commit awful things to achieve their ends. And sometimes, and not the ends do justify the means, sometimes things have to be looked at a different way. I'm not sure what you would think on this. Should we be deplatforming if we are at risk of being deplatformed ourselves? Almost as a joke to the other side to say, perhaps what you're doing isn't the best thing.
Yes. I think what you say it definitely has a point, and I say this with great reluctance, because I don't want to say, okay, just because they're playing dirty, that we should play dirty.
No, I wouldn't say the same either, yes.
But nonetheless, I do think there's a very good argument that can be made that if people are acting in a very outrageous and disrespectful way towards us to try and deplatform us, we have every single right to try to do the same towards them as well. Now, the way in which we go around doing it might not need to fall to the levels of which they're going towards it. We can do it in an upright, upfront way, such that everyone knows that it's us who's doing it instead of attacking in the shadows. But nonetheless, I think if we have tools available to us, it is vital that we use it. And I've been reading a book called The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene recently. And one of the laws there is, if you have an enemy who tries to destroy you, you must destroy them, and destroy them completely, utterly, such that there's no chance they get back at you. And, you know, I think that's a pretty decent idea. Not that I say we should destroy people because Christ tells us to love. But in the case that someone wants to make themselves an enemy of you, to rise themselves to your level, to try to fight you, then you must hit the head on the serpent.
I'd say it is entirely fair and just, because, let's say, one doesn't want to rise, one wants to be an enemy to someone, but if someone chooses to be an enemy and make themselves an enemy, they have brought it upon themselves. So the right is to the attacked to fight back. I suppose in the same sense of Israel at the moment. Israel was attacked by Hamas, a terrorist group. So indeed, I think, would believe has every single right to fight back against and defend itself. And indeed, they're following a similar law of Robert Greene in this sense of they wish to utterly eliminate Hamas to every extent to make sure it can never rise again. And it is indeed the logical approach in anything. If you have an enemy who wishes to destroy you, you destroy them so they cannot stand back up. Not in a necessarily violent sense, but in a metaphorical instance.
Now, this brings us to the last question of this video. Do we still have free speech in today's society?
No, it's a very short and simple answer. If we look at even the Equalities Act at the moment, it seems we have to legislate in the courts to make speech free. There is no utter indemnable right to free speech. We see the examples of even Maya Forstater in her case, which was recently won before the Supreme Court. She had to go to the Supreme Court for an employment tribunal because she was fired, almost not had her contract renewed over tweets she made relating to a man as a man and a woman as a woman, or sort of along those lines. And the employment tribunal said her views were akin to Nazism almost. They are not suitable for respect in modern society, which is the general criteria for being part of the strong philosophical beliefs protection under the Equalities Act. And she then had to show, and the appeals judge agreed with her, the company appealed that, it went to then the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with her. She had to show her speech was able to be said and set legal precedent for allow it to be. And that goes against almost every instance of law we have in the country. The general approach to law here is not the German approach. The approach here is if something is not outlawed, it is legal. Not if it is not explicitly allowed, we shouldn't be allowed to do it. And that's where speech is failing at the moment in this country. We see instances of in a bank manager somewhere in the north was fired from his job for questioning something in a diversity training meeting. He won his case in the employment tribunal. He had to prove what he said was not offensive and was allowed within free speech. And to have cases like this happen all across the country, and by even those who can't afford to fight them, so don't come up to public image and press, I think it demonstrates that we simply do not have free speech in its proper form.
Completely agree with you on that, and I can't put it better myself. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Oxford Conservatives Talks podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes, and have a good one. God bless, and stay safe.
Don't cancel us, please.
Please don't.